Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: South Korea's president visiting the U.S. for the first time, but building stronger ties isn't easy.
But we're going to have some very serious discussions about different things, including trade.
China expert Gordon Chang weighs in on South Korea's president and his approach to U.S. China relations.
Jae Myung has traditionally been very China-friendly, very hostile to the United States.
The U.S. Space Force launching a new mission, its secret space drone. Officials say it marks Washington's push to stay ahead of China across every battlefield. And the U.S. government taking stakes in chip giant Intel, but that's not all. White House advisor Kevin Hassett says they could do the same with other U.S. chip companies. South Korean President Jae Myung visited the White House Monday for his first official trip to Washington since taking office. He wrapped up a record-breaking visit to Japan before flying to the U.S. Once at the White House, Lee and President Trump discussed cooperation in shipbuilding, a topic Trump showed strong interest in. Lee also stressed that peace on the Korean peninsula depends heavily on the Trump administration.
South Korea's recently anointed president Lee Jae-myung arrives in Washington ready for talks at the White House. Before the White House meeting, he told reporters he had read The Art of the Deal, the book written by President Trump. At the White House, Lee praised Trump's renovations, saying they make the building brighter, and calls the U.S. president a peacemaker.
저도 골프도 칠 수 있게 해주시고, 그래서 전 세계가 인정하는 정말 세계사적인 평화의 메이커로서의 역할을 꼭 해주시기를 기대합니다.
And I would like to mention that the only remaining divided nation in the world is the Korean Peninsula. And I would like to ask for your role in establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula. So I look forward to your meeting with Chairman Kim Jong-un and construction of a Trump Tower in North Korea and playing golf at that place.
Trump said he has a strong relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and hopes to meet him again at the right time.
Is it possible you meet him this year or maybe next year?
Well, I'm meeting a lot of people. I mean, it's hard to say that, but I'd like to meet him this year.
Both leaders agree on staying engaged with Pyongyang's over North Korea's nuclear program and denuclearization. On trade, the U.S. and South Korea recently reached a new agreement, though Washington is still pushing Seoul to open its markets to American agriculture and livestock products. So far, Seoul has been reluctant to revisit trade details during this summit. Trump says he will have serious discussions with Lee on trade and other key issues. He also spotlights shipbuilding.
But we're going to be buying ships from South Korea, but we're also going to have them make ships here with our people, using our people. And we're going to go back into the shipbuilding business again.
The Trump administration is working to revitalize U.S. shipbuilding through closer cooperation with allies. On security, the two leaders are set to discuss South Korea's defense budget, U.S. arms sales, and the future deployment of American forces on the Korean peninsula. Ahead of the White House meeting, Lee told reporters Seoul would have trouble accepting U.S. demands for flexibility in how American troops operate in the country. That is, allowing U.S. forces to handle regional security issues, such as China. In countering China's growing ambitions, the U.S.-Japan-South Korea alliance remains vital. That's likely why Lee broke with diplomatic tradition, visiting Tokyo first to meet with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba before heading to Washington. Both leaders agreed that strengthening cooperation among Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. was essential.
While South Korean President Lee Jae Myung is visiting the United States, he's also sending a special envoy delegation to Beijing. The team met separately with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Commerce Minister Wang Wentao. Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao said he welcomed China's trade deficit with South Korea, in other words, Seoul's trade surplus. That marks a shift. South Korea ran a deficit with China through 2023 and into the first half of 2024. During talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, South Korean envoys delivered a handwritten letter from President Lee Jae Myung to Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping, inviting Xi to attend this October's APEC summit in South Korea. The head of the delegation said Lee hopes to bring Seoul-Beijing relations back on track. That's a sharp contrast with Lee's predecessor, former President Yoon Suk-yeol. Yoon pursued a pro-U.S., tough-on-China policy, strengthening the U.S.-Korea alliance while mending fences with Japan over historical disputes. Meanwhile, reports say the South Korean delegation is unlikely to meet with Xi. At the same time, South Korea's National Assembly Speaker, a close ally of President Lee, will attend a military parade in Beijing in early September. He describes his relationship with Lee not as political loyalty, but as a value-based alliance. To unpack the relations between the U.S., South Korea, and China, we spoke with retired Marine Colonel Grant Newsham and political analyst Gordon Chang. To start, the U.S. wants Seoul to play a bigger role in countering China. How likely is that? Let's take a closer look.
It's really unlikely. The leftists, the Democratic Party of Korea, of Jae Myung, has traditionally been very China-friendly, very hostile to the United States. I mean, Yi himself, 4 years ago, called the American troops in Korea an occupying force. And even more explosively, he blamed us for the continued Japanese rule during the colonial period. Now, his charges, I think, don't have any basis in fact, but that's the way he feels. You know, we have seen the leftists basically say, well, look, you know, South Korea, protected by the U.S. alliance, should play what they call a balancing role in North Asia between the two big groups, one, China and North Korea on the other side, and the U.S. and Japan on the other. Now, one can say a lot of things about that, but the only reason why South Korea exists is because the United States protects it. Well, Jae Myung wants an accommodation with North Korea. He's worked very hard. And so we're going to see probably this raise. Now, President Trump in his first term tried to have an accommodation with Kim Jong-un. That ultimately failed because the issue, of course, nuclear weapons. But from Yi's point of view, he'll do everything possible to support the North Koreans, including sending them money, which he did already and was actually convicted for. So really what we've got is a very pro-China, very pro-North Korea ruling group, but it doesn't have the support of the Korean people.
And Grant, as you mentioned, defense costs are said to be a key issue at the summit. President Trump has long said South Korea needs to pay more for the roughly 29,000 U.S. troops based there. What are you watching for in this area? Could we see more security ties between the two?
Well, this, I think, is really sort of a distraction. I think we put too much effort in trying to squeeze money out of our allies, in Asia at least, when it comes to the Japanese and the South Koreans. They do need to pay more for their own defense. But in terms of, say, shaking them down for more for us, I think it's an effort that is probably put in the wrong place. There's other bigger things to do. Even if the South Koreans say, okay, we'll pay $100 million more, I would say, so what? Because it doesn't get to that fundamental question, the issue of the nature of the South Korean administration and the nature of South Korean leftists and what they intend to do. If we just ignore that and say try to get some more money out of the South Koreans, that we are going to find ourselves, I think, in a very difficult position.
And Gordon, expanding on that, break down for us what's at stake in this White House summit. Where could U.S.-South Korea relations go from here?
Anything can happen, Tiffany. Because Yi is very anti-American, it is not inconceivable that one way or another he will break the alliance. Now, we have gotten through a number of leftist presidents, 3 of them before, and I think there's a confidence in the State Department that they can just outlast Yi. But I'm not so sure that's true because Yi is much more determined than any of the 3 leftist presidents before him. So especially with China that is pressing South Korea, I think that you could find the relationship could be broken. And that's one of the reasons why I think President Trump should not raise the issue of increased South Korean contributions to the United States, because Yi just might say, look, I don't want your troops here anyway. So this is a very difficult situation. And let's, if I could just emphasize what Grant said, Yi is attacking democracy. He's outlawing opposition parties. He's going after everybody. This could be a one-party state in about 6 months.
The U.S. Space Force launched a new mission involving its secret space drone last week. It's part of the military's push to remain the dominant force across all theaters of war. Our Washington correspondent Luis Eduardo Martinez has more on the story.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engines full power and liftoff. Go single, go USS 36.
The U.S. Space Force launched its secret space drone, the X-37B, aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket earlier this week. Its mission will help improve the U.S. military's laser communication systems and test its quantum inertial navigation systems, which would allow the U.S. military to avoid reliance on GPS. The U.S. is preparing for future and modern warfare, which heavily relies on drone technology in unconventional theaters, in this case, space.
Nobody expected flimsy Japanese fighters to sink America's battleships at Pearl Harbor. Nobody expected 19 hijackers with box cutters to turn passenger jets into missiles on 9/11. And today, I fear we're making the same mistake with drones. Nobody's expecting them to cause catastrophic damage. But sadly, it's only a matter of time.
U.S. adversaries like China can produce up to 700,000 FPV drones monthly, while the U.S. can only produce several thousands. That's why the Trump administration has instructed the Pentagon to boost the production of U.S.-made drones. Congress has also allocated over $33 billion in the One Big Beautiful Bill to drone production in the United States, a number that could increase to over $50 billion through the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2026.
So while our adversaries have produced millions of cheap drones, before us, we were mired in bureaucratic red tape. Not anymore. In June, President Trump issued an executive order unleashing American drone dominance to bolster our drone industry and arm our warfighters.
The Trump administration is also considering a $50 billion deal to purchase over 50 million battle-tested Ukrainian military drones for the U.S. military. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett says the federal government could take stakes in other U.S. semiconductor companies following its recent investment in Intel. Hassett explained the reasoning behind the deal in an interview with CNBC on a Monday. Here's what he had to say.
In the end, they worked out a deal where Intel is going to get the CHIPS money, but in exchange, we're going to get some equity, and equity is not voting, so there's not going to be government intrusion into the business of Intel. It's more like a down payment on a sovereign wealth fund, which many, many countries have.
Hassett told CNBC that the Trump administration was considering similar deals in other industries. The 10% Intel investment marks the latest government deal with U.S. companies. Hassett added that money from the CHIPS Act is going out as planned. When asked about government intrusion, Hassett told the network that the administration's move was not unprecedented. Hassett pointed to the government-sponsored mortgage enterprises Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Trump said on Truth Social, quote, "I will make deals like that for our country all day long."
Coming up, a U.S. citizen is indicted in Germany for allegedly trying to pass sensitive information to China. The man worked inside a U.S. military facility on German soil. China's former property giant Evergrande is delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. While it likely won't be the last Chinese real estate company to face this fate. And Venezuela is sending tens of thousands of troops and police to the border as U.S. Marines move in. How is China responding? That and more in just a minute here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A new espionage case out of Germany. A U.S. citizen who worked at a military facility there allegedly offered sensitive information to China. German prosecutors announced on Monday that he has been indicted on espionage charges. The suspect was arrested in Frankfurt in early November. He is charged with declaring his willingness to spy for a foreign intelligence service. Authorities say he repeatedly contacted Chinese officials in the summer of 2024 and offered to provide sensitive U.S. military information for Chinese intelligence. German media report that he apparently did not manage to transfer any data before his arrest. China's former property giant Evergrande was delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange on Monday. The delisting closes a chapter in China's property crisis that started in 2021. Evergrande isn't expected to be the last Chinese real estate company to face the same fate. Here's a closer look.
China Evergrande's epic boom-to-bust journey is a cautionary tale for the country's property sector. Evergrande was once China's leading developer. Its original listing in Hong Kong in 2009 was the biggest by a Chinese private developer. But the firm also had the largest pile of debt in the property sector globally.
Evergrande is one of this landmark example of the collapse of the China's real estate sector a few years ago. So what we see right now in the listing, it is really largely symbolic because the market has pretty much anticipated the pressure in the sector already. So having said that, it still marks the end of the golden age of China real estate sector.
The developer started with a strong public market debut and a stock value of $9 billion. It grew more than fivefold to $51 billion, only to plummet in recent years. And Evergrande is now worth a mere $282 million. Trading in shares in the world's most indebted developer has been suspended since January last year. It was hit with a liquidation order after it defaulted on debt and failed to finalise a restructuring plan. A filing showed Evergrande is getting delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange due to its failure to resume trading within 18 months. The delisting will close a chapter in China's property crisis that started in 2021. Evergrande is also unlikely to be the last to meet the same fate. China South City became the first state-backed property developer to get a liquidation order from the Hong Kong High Court earlier this month.
It is possible for more companies to follow the same path of Evergrande, and especially for those that cannot meet the listing requirement in terms of the disclosure and also the auditing releases. And if they get their stock suspended for more than 18 months, then they will be forced to delist from Hong Kong Exchange.
Chinese authorities have tried to revive the property sector over the years, which once made up for a quarter of its GDP. While buyers wait for their unfinished homes to be handed over and creditors hope to recoup their money. Evergrande declined to comment.
Tensions between the U.S. and China are escalating over Venezuela. At a recent event, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro flexed his new Huawei smartphone, gifted by the Chinese regime leader. He claimed the phone has a direct satellite communication channel to the Chinese leader. Here's the story. The U.S. banned Chinese smartphone maker Huawei for its close ties to the Chinese regime and China's military. Meanwhile, Fox News reported that at least 3 U.S. destroyers are en route to Venezuela, equipped with missile systems and thousands of Marines. The military operation is part of President Trump's effort to crack down on crimes and drugs, including fentanyl, brought into the U.S. by cartel groups. In response, Maduro said he would put 4.5 million militia members' boots on the ground. China voiced against the U.S. military operation. It's worth noting China has found to be a major source of fentanyl precursors. Through cartel groups, these chemicals are being pressed into fentanyl pills and smuggled into the U.S. According to the U.S. CDC, fentanyl overdoses are the top cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. And Nicolas Maduro has sent 15,000 troops and law enforcement officers to the border, along with an unspecified number of boats, aircraft, and drones. Venezuela's interior minister revealed the operation on Monday. Over in the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan failed to pass a referendum that would have brought its last nuclear plant back into operation. The referendum needed 25% of eligible voters to vote, but it fell short by about 3%. The referendum is backed by 2 opposition parties. They say Taiwan needs to cut its reliance on imported power, as almost all of Taiwan's energy comes from imports. This is sparking concerns that China could use this vulnerability to attack the island. But bringing back nuclear plants may be easier said than done. Taiwan is an earthquake-prone area, so the risk of accidents plus how to handle nuclear waste have become the 2 major concerns for Taiwan's ruling party. But still, Taiwan's power demand is expected to rise 13% by the end of the decade. The island produces most of the world's high-end semiconductors, which requires a lot of energy. Although the referendum failed, Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te said he recognizes the need for diverse energy options. He also left open the possibility of returning to nuclear power if it becomes safer and cleaner. Taiwan's opposition lawmakers survived another recall vote on Saturday, marking the second setback for the ruling party in its efforts to counter Beijing's influence on the island. Here's a closer look.
On Saturday, Taiwan held its second recall vote in less than a month. All opposition lawmakers retained their seats.
24 lawmakers from the opposition Kuomintang Party, or KMT, survived the recall vote on July 26th. Another 7 lawmakers withstood Saturday's vote, marking Taiwan's largest recall attempt ever.
This is an expression of the people's will, and we must all respect and accept the result.
President Lai's party won last year's presidential election but fell short of a legislative majority. Since then, the opposition party have worked to limit the Lai administration's power and block key legislation. The recall campaign was driven by groups alarmed at the opposition party's closeness to China. These groups fear Beijing could exploit the party's legislative majority to weaken Taiwan's national defense, interfere in elections, and potentially aid a Chinese takeover.
Beijing residents are still dealing with the aftermath of recent floods. The disaster also shows how rural districts around the capital remain unprepared for flooding. Here's more.
64-year-old Ma Guixi had her home destroyed by floods that devastated northern China last month. The district her village is in, Huairou, and neighboring Miyun district, just on the outskirts of Beijing, received a year's worth of rain in a single week. It led to Beijing's deadliest flood since 2012. Entire villages were mired in mud, and 44 people were killed. Ma says she's never experienced anything like this all her life, and she's still terrified. She recalled the chaos after she was rescued, how there was no internet and couldn't contact her children. Beijing, situated in a historically dry area in China, saw citywide rainfall surge by 75% from a year earlier, in June and July. Since 2012, the Chinese capital has experienced 3 deluges that forecasters had said could only happen once every 100 years. In the recent Beijing floods, the authorities' most serious weather warning came too late for most villagers in Huairou. Many were already asleep by the time it was issued. 31 elderly residents of a nursing home in Miyun were among the dead. They had not been included in evacuation plans and were trapped in the rising waters.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For On the Clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.